They thought that the aliens had easily spanned galaxies, destroyed civilizations, and claimed entire worlds, including Earth. Would be no different they had examined it remotely, taking in its expansive landscapes and coming to the conclusion that it was a primitive species reside on the backwater planet, where they are unaware of an impending onslaught until it is too late. They arrived late, but their task was to simply terraform and move on to the next target. The planet's flat, broad plains would be the ideal place to start, but without any fortifications, opposition, or structures, the situation would end in a few days. For hours, maybe, their ship silently hung above the Earth, throwing a shadow across the boundless grassland. Using their sophisticated scanners, they were able to view the microscopic life forms beneath animals that were not aware that superior creatures were observing them from above started deploying their sophisticated machinery, which is intended to alter the planet's very soil and air. Thought saw it as just another ordinary procedure, not realizing that they were being observed far from their advanced sensors and masking fields. A horse-drawn person appeared in the distance. Just a man with a gun, a wide hat pulled low over his brow, and worn boots with his hands carelessly clasped. He appeared to the invaders as just another basic biological speck. The idea that this man could endanger their mission in such an undeveloped world never occurred to them. In their thoughts that they had previously defeated more stronger opponents, and always Cowboy remained motionless, his eyes narrowing as he took in the odd forms in the sky and the way the land shimmered beneath them. He had spent the majority of his life on this country, so he was familiar with every detail, including the shifts in the wind and the call of he could sense deep down that what he was seeing in the wild was incorrect and not natural. His bones caused a disturbance in the atmosphere, as though the ground itself was warning him, but he remained calm and composed. He had seen more than enough in his years to know that fear was never a solution to the alien robots' problems. Started digging into the ground and emitting dust and smoke puffs as they started the process of changing the atmosphere of the Earth was a meticulous, lengthy process, but one that had previously operated flawlessly on innumerable worlds. Therefore, they weren't prepared for opposition here, especially in this isolated area. Empty land, the rancher gradually turned his horse back, riding back toward the tiny. He realized there was no need for haste or panic, because the cabin was just a few kilometers away. As he rode, his thoughts went through these plains like the back of his hand, and he knew exactly where he needed to go. The issue before him was that he had no idea who had sent these machines or what they were, but he did know one thing. When he got at the cottage, a basic building constructed of wood and stone, they weren't kind nor helpful. Inside, it was little more than a makeshift shelter from the weather, so he took some food, extra ammunition, rope, and water bottle. He examined the firearm in his hands to ensure it was clean and ready to fire. It wasn't much, but it had sufficed for him in previous instances. Wasn't a man who required much assistance from his horse, so he rode out once again, traveling straight toward the odd shimmering field in the distance, and the closer he went, the more obvious the threat was. The air felt heavy and weird, like something that wasn't supposed to be here. The birds had dispersed and gone silent, and the ground was responding as though it realized it was under later. The cowboy dismounted when he arrived at a ridge that provided a view of the field where the machines were in operation. Unknown to him, he took his gun from its sling and lay flat on the ground, observing everything with great care. Observing tall, spindly buildings moving while a creepy, dim light pulses through them, he counted at least 5 of them, each dispersed throughout a large area with a mechanical precision that seemed almost alive. It was invading the Earth like parasites, and he knew that, with what he had, he couldn't destroy them all at once. But he didn't have to. All he had to do was take some time to slow them down on his own so he could assess the situation. He zeroed down on the nearest machine by sighting down the barrel of his gun. A long shot, even for him, yet the cowboy's finger rested on it frequently. Pulling lightly on the trigger causes the environment to shrink to the distance between him and his target, and the rifle to fracture. A crisp shot resounded throughout the plains, and then the bullet struck its mark, striking it. Sparks shot from a weak point at the machine's base, and the machine lurched to one side, unsteadying its fragile equilibrium. Disturbed, it stopped moving but didn't fall. A quiet hum coming from deep the cowboy permitted himself a tiny, contented smile within its framework. Their focus from the extraterrestrial spacecraft above the invaders' blaring alarms couldn't believe what they were witnessing. A rudimentary missile had injured one of their machines. With technology that shouldn't have posed any threat to them, they promptly adjusted their sensors and started looking for the attack's origin, but the cowboy had already left, traveling across the terrain quickly and soundlessly before vanishing. They sent a small squad into the creases of the earth to look into hovering drones meant for reconnaissance, but the Cowboy wasn't a fool. He kept low and moved between covers. With his rifle ready and staying just out of sight, he observed the drones flying overhead, their sleek bodies cutting. He knew he couldn't stay hidden in the air forever, but he didn't. All he needed to do was exercise patience, which he possessed in abundance. The Cowboy was ready for his next move as the sun started to drop, creating long shadows across the plains. He had no idea what to do. Regardless of their identity, it was inconsequential that they had invaded his territory. Believing that it was theirs to take, they had underestimated him, and that was their chance to learn. Initial error 1, that wouldn't be their last. The Cowboy moved like a ghost, striking quickly and vanishing before the extraterrestrials could react. When one of their machines failed and became unusable, the invaders were unable to comprehend why this was occurring. They were meant to be unstoppable and invincible, but on this odd, by the time the sun reached the planet, a lone guy armed only with a rifle and his cunning had already surpassed them. Increased once more, the aliens started to feel a panic they had never felt before, that they hadn't anticipated opposition. They had believed that the odd surface readings were anomalies that could be readily resolved by the drones. Raced low across the plains, looking for the cause of the disturbance, but all they found was dust. They believed the damage to the first machine had been an accident caused by wind and rocks. Maybe due to a glitch in their own systems. They were unable to comprehend that a single person was the reason of the Cowboy. He realized they were looking for him as he watched them from behind the craggy ridgelines of the terrain, but they didn't recognize that despite their amazing technology, these aliens were still visitors unfamiliar with the area. They were unaware of the wind's direction changes around twilight. When the storm passed, the earth softened, and just before sunset, the shadows spanned the plains. The Cowboy was not the type of man to charge into a situation. Instead, he knew things like the back of his hand that provided him an advantage. Combat head-on, preferring to hold off on striking until he was certain it would make a difference. With his weapon leaning against his leg, he observed the alien machines and their slow, deliberate work. They moved like clockwork, rushing across the field, oblivious to the menace that was still present nearby. The Cowboy wasn't completed, but in the interim, the aliens had started a more thorough study. They sent a small troops in metallic armor make their way to the surface. Their movements rigid and robots, they bore weapons that hummed softly and glowed with a power that no human had ever seen before. Was just another standard procedure, a straightforward chore of eliminating any residual interference about which they were unaware. As the team moved toward the location where the first machine had sustained damage, the Cowboy altered Ed's posture so that he would not be spotted, while keeping a close eye on them, observing their gestures and habits. He knew that he had seen deadly men before, but this was different. The creature's armor and weaponry were considerably superior to his, and they moved with the precision of robots. Had never experienced, but fear was not something he could afford. Enable the men to disperse and search the area for any indications of life using their illuminating devices. They knelt to inspect the damaged apparatus, their spindly arms probing the metal to gauge the degree of damage. Though they appeared more bored than vigilant, the others stood watch, their weapons at the ready, something they weren't expecting to find. The Cowboy took aim and steadied his breathing, realizing that this was their second error. He knew he couldn't remove them all at once, but all he needed to do was light his finger on the trigger, was to give them the impression that they were exposed, as his weapon crackled through the air, sending reverberations throughout the plains. The person next to the machine fell instantaneously, its armor pierced by the bullet, while the others jolted, startled, and spinning. Before they could respond, the Cowboy had already started to move, sliding down the ridge. They circled to find the source of the shot. The surviving troops extended their guns and began firing, using the terrain's natural concealment to keep out of sight. Bolts of energy shot aimlessly into the shadows, scorching the grass and rocks where the CBA had been only moments before. Moments before, though, he had vanished, disappearing into the landscape like a shadow as the aliens swiftly regrouped. Their heads turning back and forth in search of something, their motions more circumspect, now that they had established a closer perimeter. One of them, the invisible threat, growled commands at the others to spread apart in their peculiar, guttural tongue and cover more territory. They were now on high alert, but it made no difference to the Cowboy. Was aware of their TAC-IC and relied on their robot's technology to keep them safe, but they weren't grasped the land, didn't know how quickly it could turn against them, and a second shot went off. The soldier abandoned the unit while the others shot frantically into the distance. The cowboy had already started moving once more, following them while keeping his head down and patiently waiting for the ideal time to attack once more. His advantage wasn't in strength or speed, was a sense of when to act. As the last few men crowded close, their weapons up in a defensive stance. This was meant to be a straightforward mission and an easy conquest, but their element was suddenly unclear of what they were dealing with. They had never experienced anything similar before, so they couldn't explain why something had gone wrong. Adversary they were unable to see or identify who appeared out of nowhere, disappeared back aboard their ship, and commanders were becoming irritated because they couldn't figure out why a straightforward surface assignment was taking their squad so long. Deployed more than an hour ago, and as of this now, there has been no improvement. The injured machine is still offline, and two of their commanders put out desperate orders for reinforcements, but they were too late because their soldiers had stopped talking. The remaining squad was now on its own as they were traveling swiftly to arrive. Cowboy observed the aliens attempting to reorganize, noting the strain in their movements and the way they faltered. They were nervous before taking each step because they didn't know what would come next. He positioned his next shot just where he wanted them to be, but instead of firing, he chose to wait and observe. He released the men as they gradually started to withdraw, pulling away from the ridge and in the direction of their ship's safety. His intention was to make them reconsider returning, not to eradicate them completely, thus there was no need to kill them all. He wanted them to be frightened, uneasy, and unsteady, and based on how they hastily returned to their spacecraft, looking across the horizon for any indication of him, their heads snapping back and forth. When the final soldier vanished over the slope, the cowboy remained low in the work. It was only then that he stood up, his self-purchased weapon slung over his shoulder. A while, but he was aware that it wouldn't last because the aliens would eventually return, be more ready the next time, but he would also. He turned and headed back, moving in the direction of the cabin, his thoughts already formulating the next move these invaders would take on his property. They thought they were invincible because of their technology and machines, but now that they had it all theirs. They were aware of something distinct. They understood that this area was home to defenders who would not surrender easily. Cowboy moved carefully, examining the horizon with his eyes. He wasn't sure how long he had left before the aliens came again, but regardless, he would be prepared for them. They had misjudged him. Wouldn't have the opportunity to do it again. After arriving to the cabin, he took a minute to pause and gaze out over the plains. Although the land was finally quiet, the conflict was far from over, so it wouldn't last for long. Not yet, but he wasn't concerned because he already had all he needed. When the moment came, he made sure the invaders understood one last time that they weren't welcome here. The commanders expressed dissatisfaction as the initial routine mission swiftly turned into something unexpected. Anticipated opposition, because the squad's findings had been ambiguous and contradictory. However, one thing was evident: an unidentified menace was methodically decimating their forces. Their pride allowed them to survive on a world they had thought to be weak and primitive. They found it difficult to accept the situation they were in and struggled to understand how one person could be in charge. The surface searches for their losses revealed no organized military presence, sophisticated weaponry only on isolated populations and vast areas of territory, something that technologies ought to have little trouble conquering everything that this planet had to offer. But their technology had let them down, and the soldiers who were assigned to look into it hadn't returned, and the landscape reshaping machine's task stayed offline. The alien leaders discussed how what had appeared to be a straightforward task was become more difficult by the minute. Their choices, some of them voicing their agitated voices, calling for a full-scale assault with a demonstration of power to smash any surviving opposition. Others advised them to retreat and reconsider their strategy, but they didn't act in that way. Especially not when their judgments were dictated by pride and arrogance in the face of what they saw to be a lesser species. Sent in reinforcements, this time with a more specialist unit equipped to handle irregular warfare. Wouldn't undervalue the adversary, as these new men carried much more sophisticated weaponry and tactical gear. Their instructions were to simply discover the source of the resistance and eradicate it, as they were meant to adapt to unknown dangers. On the surface, the cowboy was waiting because he had anticipated them, regardless of the cost, to return, and he was aware that they wouldn't be as heedless or cautious as they had been in the past because they had misjudged him, but that advantage wouldn't last because they were going to return and would be prepared. That didn't bother him because he had before seen tougher odds and had Vicky managed to live by being composed and recognizing when to fight and when to retreat. Arriving in silence, the extraterrestrial reinforcements felt shapes moved with them as they sliced across the night sky like phantoms. With deliberate precision, they disperse over the region in an attempt to cover ground and eliminate their invisible adversary. Unlike the earlier squad, the soldiers were well-behaved, meticulous, and prepared. Their scanners were more sensitive enough to pick up even the smallest movement or thermal signature chance. The cowboy observed them from a distance, keeping low to the ground so he could see how they were skilled professionals because of the manner they maneuvered to shield each other's flanks. This would be a more difficult battle, but he wasn't going to go toe-to-toe with them since he didn't need to. All he needed to accomplish was. His greatest advantage was to stay one step ahead of them and make them believe he knew this region while they didn't. With their advanced technology, the soldiers moved like well-oiled machines as they advanced carefully and swept the area with their guns. Rose, prepared to shoot at any hint of movement. But the Cowboy showed patience, had long since discovered that knowing when to remain hidden was essential to survival, so he waited and watched as they suddenly, one of the troops appeared as their lights flickered through the woods and across the open plains. Calmly beeped his scanner, froze, and motioned for the others to gather around him. The Cowboy tensely observing them attentively. He wasn't sure what they had discovered, but the troops had formed a tight circle. With their rifles pointed forward and their helmets scanning all directions, they weren't hiding anything they had noticed. In the quiet, the Cowboy took a chance and moved with a crack of his rifle fired, knocking the aliens away from the soldier positioned in the middle. Of the circle fell, his body collapsing to the ground, and the others responded immediately, lighting their weapons. Brightened the darkness with sudden explosive outbursts, but the Cowboy had already vanished. The surviving soldiers into the ground, taking advantage of the natural cover. Spread out, their voices growing in a tongue the Cowboy didn't comprehend. They were bewildered and frustrated. Even with its superior technology, the apparatus was unable to locate his precise location. He was always just out of reach and moving more quickly than they had anticipated, making it impossible for them to see or follow him everywhere. All they knew was that he was out there, eliminating them one by one for the benefit of the alien commanders on board. The situation was getting worse, with intermittent reports from the ground expressing bewilderment and dread that in spite of their efforts, the soldiers were unable to take command of the situation. Despite having the best equipment and tactical training, they were being outwitted by a single person who appeared to know everything. It was a blow to their confidence that they hadn't been able to cover every square inch of the ground with their equipment. Expected to suffer on such a world, the Cowboy resumed his assault on the plains, passing through them like a ghost. He didn't shoot often that night, but when he did, he made every shot matter. Eliminating another soldier, further confusing the alien forces, who were moving with increasing desperation, going crazy as they attempted to predict where he would attack next, but they were unable to do so because he was always one step ahead. The extraterrestrial reinforcements started to retreat from ahead, always just out of reach. Regrouping in a defensive formation, they understood that their strategies had failed them and they could no longer battle him on his terms. Failed, they required a fresh strategy, but the CBA wouldn't allow them the time to come up with one. He persisted in applying pressure, causing them to pull back even further. The commanders, viewing from their ship as they moved from the plains into their landing zone, were enraged because they had never faced opposition such to this before, particularly not from a species they considered inferior. Their ego made it difficult for them to acknowledge the truth of the circumstances, even though it was evident from the data that they were losing their advance when it came to technology in superior numbers. This Cowboy was human. Once they were defeated, the alien forces on the ground started to fully retreat. With their retreat developing into a full-blown withdrawal, they had lost interest in continuing to battle the Cowboy. Evident that this area was not theirs to steal, and they were forced to acknowledge this to each and every one of their soldiers. Ed withdrew, vanishing into the darkness as they made their way back to their ships, where they would inform their commanders, and maybe they would come back eventually, but for now the fight was with his weapon resting in his hands. The Cowboy watched them depart, but chose not to follow. They had gotten the lesson, therefore there was no need to worry for the time being. He had safeguarded. He stood there for a long time, staring. It was his land, and that was all that counted. With their ships fading into the horizon as the final alien forces vanished into the sky, they had their biggest error had been underestimating him from the beginning, as he had demonstrated to them that regardless of no matter how strong they believed themselves to be, Their technology was so advanced that there were some wars they couldn't win. The alien leaders were forced to escalate since they could not win here or on his land. They lost too, because what had begun as a small-scale operation had now expanded to something they couldn't ignore. Their dignity had been damaged by having too many soldiers and too many machines for every human. However, suddenly it was about control, something they couldn't afford rather than just pride. This planet and this area of territory had come to represent their failure if they allowed it to go unanswered, and that was something the cowboy knew they would come back, so they wouldn't put up with him. He had bought himself some time, but the invaders had a reason for coming here, and they wouldn't leave until they achieved it or were compelled to acknowledge that although he had forced them to retreat once, they would return stronger and more prepared. To startle him, he had anticipated it. Holding his weapon, he stood outside the tiny hut. The land opened up before him, silent and empty, but he could see over his shoulder. He didn't need to, but he could sense the tension in the air and how the earth appeared to be holding its breath. This time, it would be different in that they wouldn't be able to see their ships to know they were approaching. Undervalue him, the cowboy needed to plan ahead since his mind worked swiftly. Keep 2 steps ahead of them because he knew their technology was superior than anything he had ever seen. Wasn't all he had discovered long ago that the secret to existence was employing the aliens didn't realize that you had to be able to adapt to what you had since they depended too heavily on without their machines and devices, they were unable to fight. So he moved, walking steadily across the plains, satisfied that there was nothing to worry about. Location on this land that he wasn't familiar with, and that he hadn't been 100 times even with all the soldiers and weaponry they brought. Invaders would still be strangers from outside the area. They were unable to recognize that as his advantage, and he planned to utilize it as he strolled, scanning the horizon with his gaze, knowing they would soon arrive. And he needed to be prepared because the battle would be more difficult, and they wouldn't send the same soldiers he had previously encountered, would not send anything more hazardous. Something they thought would ultimately vanquish him, but the cowboy didn't care about danger because he had faced it his entire life. Didn't frighten him being astute, and being 1 step ahead was what counted. And never allowing them to corner him. As the sky grew darker, he sensed a shift in the atmosphere they were now near. He lingered for a time, taking in the atmosphere, and could almost feel the weight of their presence. Taking a deep breath, he accelerated his pace once more and headed toward higher ground. Would give them a fight on his terms, not theirs, if they so desired. Alien spacecraft quietly and sleekly marched in formation as they emerged on the horizon. Dispersing throughout the plains in a purposeful, well-coordinated endeavor, they weren't wasting any time. Their objective was to eradicate the danger and safeguard the territory, while the CBA observed them from afar. His weapon at the ready, his expression cool. They may have the numbers, but he had the first wave of men under his control. Touched down, their mechanical boots sinking into the ground. These troops were different from the ones he had previously encountered. These were the elites, the ones dispatched, moving with purpose, their weapons heavier, their armor thicker. Manage missions when failure was not an option. The CBA observed them dispersing their exact and orderly motions. They weren't here to make errors, so the cowboy waited, hiding among the land's organic cover. He remained motionless until he was certain that his greatest strength had always been patience. Had discovered a long time ago that timing was more important for success than strength or speed. Strike. But the timing wasn't ideal at the moment, so the soldiers advanced. Their scanners were combing the area, but this time they went slowly and deliberately. Keeping a close lookout for any movement or hint of danger, the cowboys maintained a quiet breathing pattern and steady gaze. He never left them because he understood how to wait and become invisible until when the time was perfect, the cowboy fired, and the shot rang out like a thunderclap. One of the troops was instantaneously knocked down by the bullet's force that broke through its armor. Others responded swiftly, angling their firearms and facing the direction of the shot. But the cowboy was already on using the land's natural folds to his advantage. He moved stealthily through the landscape, maybe outwitting the soldiers. Their improved weaponry and armor, but they were still outsiders and hence vulnerable in ways they were unaware of. Another shot. Another soldier attempted to establish a defensive line against the aliens, but the cowboy never gave them a chance, striking fast and effectively and never remaining in one place long enough for them to pinpoint his whereabouts. They returned fire, illuminating the night, but their shots found nothing but empty air. The cowboy understood how to stay ahead of them since he had studied their motions and patterns. The aliens gathered, clearly frustrated that they were unable to comprehend how one person could have caused them so much worry that they had dispatched their finest soldiers there. It didn't make sense to them that they were losing the most cutting-edge technology. However, the rancher realized that although the land was his greatest ally, it wasn't simply a battleground, rather, it was home. And that was what changed everything. As the conflict, the aliens were forced to flee the higher ground as the cowboy persisted in pushing them back. They attempted to retaliate and plan a more concerted attack, but he never gave them a chance to relax. He always stayed one step ahead of them, emerging before they could react, and he struck quickly. The elite warriors started to stutter, their movements less accurate and their reactions slower. The cowboy might see that they were losing their edge and confidence. He applied further pressure. They had discovered that this was the very time he had been waiting for. They were now paying the price, one alien at a time, after they aimed him once more. Their weapons rendered worthless in their hands, their armor dense in fractures. The cowboy, with his weapon still in hand and his eyes fixed on the last of them, he didn't say anything, since the invaders had arrived on his territory with the intention of they had been mistaken. This country was never theirs to claim. They might have taken it without a struggle. Aliens started to withdraw, their spacecraft taking off into the sky and leaving the remains of its abandoned attack. The cowboy, who had won this round, watched them while maintaining a firm attitude. He was aware that the fight was not finished because they would return, as they always did. Didn't concern him because he knew he would always be prepared for the extraterrestrial troops. Complete retreat. Their once proud attack has been reduced to a hurried ship withdrawal with their motors humming. They rose from the plains and vanished into the sky, leaving behind the shattered remnants of their soldiers and equipment. The cowboy observed from a distance, his unwavering gaze steadfast. Although he had drove them away once more, he was certain that this was not the end. The alien leaders on board the command ship were enraged because they believed that the 2 times in a row he had outwitted them by using the terrain, and their expectations of an easy conquest had been dashed by his knowledge of it, resulting in a catastrophe. Their reputation as an invincible army had crumbled, their troops were disheartened, and their resources had been exhausted. In a desperate attempt to salvage something from the situation, some of the commanders desired to flee. Others asked that they depart this abandoned planet completely in order to stop their losses. Last-ditch effort to eradicate the CBA and safeguard the land, they ultimately decided to give it another shot because they were too proud to give up in defeat. However, as they had already lost too many ground forces, they would not rely on them this time. Instead, they would utilize something else, something much more terrible. The extraterrestrial leaders used their last remaining weapon. It was a last resort instrument that was rarely used and wasn't intended for accuracy, but the cowboy felt the shift before he saw it. The air seemed to be ready for annihilation when they finished playing games. With a subtle, menacing vibration, the ground beneath his boots began to thicken. Glanced up at the sky, his eyes narrowing as he noticed something new approaching. Unaware of its nature, he sensed a weight bearing down on the ground, causing a tension that hadn't before existed. Prior to acting swiftly, his gut told him that he needed to reach higher ground. As he arrived at the top of a ridge, appeared to him as a dark, expanding shape on the horizon. Was completely different from the ships they had previously utilized. The alien weapon slowly descended, its vast, intimidating bulk hovering. The cowboy sensed the electricity throbbing from the shadow that extended for miles above the plains. Something was buzzing unnaturally that sounded like it was coming from the earth itself. It wasn't just any old machine. Something far worse happened. The weapon started to glow, its CT flashing in an unsettling green light. The cowboy realized right away that this was their last move and they were done. Attempting to seize the land piece by piece now, they would destroy it completely. He needed to move quickly. So he quickly examined the horizon's. Thoughts were racing. Something had to be done to halt it. What was the weapon? Enormous. But it wasn't unbreakable. He only needed to locate its. He concentrated on the incandescent core, observing its pulse in an attempt to locate the one thing that could bring it down. Flickered, which was the key. If he could approach it closely enough, he might be able to cause it to change and break the energy chain. Before it could fire, a protective barrier encircled the weapon, making it difficult to approach. He was aware that he couldn't go up against the shimmering barrier directly, since it would repel anything that came close. It must come up with a different strategy to break around its defenses covertly. Moved swiftly, keeping low to the ground and taking use of the land's natural cover as the weapon approached overhead. Its energy was growing stronger by the second, and he was running out of time. Nothing within miles would remain but ash. If he fired, he could not allow that to occur. Not here, not on his territory. When the cowboy arrived at the crest of the ridge, his gaze was fixed on the weapon's core. He needed anything to divert his attention, so he drew their focus away from him. Even for a brief instant, he noticed a heap of rubble. He grabbed up a piece of metal from some nearby war wreckage without thinking and threw it as hard as he could. With a loud clang, the metal struck the shield as it approached the barrier, causing a ripple effect in the air as the weaponry defenses responded right away, concentrating their efforts on the opening that caused the commotion. With his rifle in hand, the cowboy dashed for the weapon, certain he would rapidly recalibrate the barrier, but if he could just get close enough, he might be able to take the crucial shot. His pulse was racing, but he maintained his composure and accuracy as he approached the edge. A few seconds to spare, he felt the heat of the energy field against his skin of the barrier and inhaled deeply. He aimed his rifle at a target and pulled the trigger, striking the weapon's core. Dead center for a little period of time. Nothing happened. Then the loud roar of the weapon began to tumble from its gigantic shape as the barrier shattered and the core burst in a dazzling flash of light. The cowboy didn't pause to rejoice as he fell to the ground with a loud crash because he knew the fight wasn't done. Nonetheless, the extraterrestrial forces had lost their weapon, but they remained standing there observing, awaiting their next move. He turned and walked steadily back across the plains. Despite the fact that he had won this round, he knew it wouldn't be the last. The invaders would return, perhaps not today, perhaps not tomorrow, but they would always return, but that didn't concern him. He would be prepared. With the alien leaders observing from the security of their weapon was incapacitated, their ship was shocked, and their last chance to retake the land was gone. It was unimaginably hard for one person to accomplish, but they had suffered a significant loss due to their pride, and now there was no turning back. The alien ships withdrew, leaving them with no choice but to depart for the time being. The cowboy was alone on the plains, staring out into the expanse of space. The sky was clear once more, and he had battled for his house, the place he knew and loved and triumphed. But he didn't stay. There was no reason to rejoice. There was no need for words because he had completed his task, and that was sufficient. Turned and left, carrying his rifle as he did so, the sun sinking behind him. Land belonged to him, and it always will, regardless of who came after him or what new string emerged. The cowboy didn't fear what lay ahead of him and would be here waiting. Confronted it once, and he would confront it once more. The invaders had learned their lesson. But the cowboy was certain of one thing: they would never steal his land. I'm sure of it, as long as he stayed here.